psychology in my PhD now. So I'm really excited to get to share this with you guys today. Notice as you guys walked in, you had a sheet handy during the lecture. So first we're going to be talking about what physical activity actually is. So I'm sure you guys have kind of an idea about that, but we're going to get into more of the nitty-gritty details. Also, we're going to be talking about the Center for Disease Control recommendations for physical activity. And we're also going to be talking about health risks of physical inactivity. So what are the health disease risks of being physically inactive? Then we're going to talk about the benefits of physical activity, because there are so many of them. And then we're going to go into some research supporting physical activity behavior change, so how to actually change your physical activity behavior, and empirically supported ways to do that. And then finally, some ideas at the very end about how to increase your physical activity in the long run. So my goal for the lecture today is to understand what physical activity is. I want you to know how it matters for physical and psychological health, and then also how you can incorporate it more into your everyday life. Garber in 2011 came up with a very all-encompassing definition of physical activity that I use in my own research and a lot of other researchers are starting to use. The reason we're using this definition is because it's very holistic. So a lot of the examples that you guys just gave me happen within a gym. So a lot of times when we think about physical activity, it happens within a gym and you have to do it in your free time. Well, this definition suggests that that's not necessarily the case. So Garber suggests that physical activity is defined as exercise, sports, and physical activities done as part of daily living. Occupation, leisure, and active transportation. So let's break that down a little bit. So part of daily living, that could be like chores that you do around your house. So vacuuming takes a lot of effort, taking the trash out, that sort of thing. So occupation, so any sort of heavy lifting of boxes that you have to do at your job or anything like that could also be considered physical activity. Leisure time, so that's any sort of physical activity you would engage in your free time outside of work or school or something that you have to be doing. And that would encompass going to the gym, but also it would encompass participating in sports or going on a hike in your leisure time or riding your bike. So, and then also active transportation is another form of physical activity that we like to think about. So when you walk up that hill from that parking lot, that's technically a form of physical activity, and it's called active transportation because you're actively transporting yourself with your own body from one point to the other. So Garber gives us this really holistic definition of what physical activity is, and I would like for you guys to start thinking about physical activity in this more holistic sense as opposed to just in the gym. Be weight training. So you said that earlier. So yeah, one example is weight training, and that would be considered an isotonic movement. Now, isokinetic movements are exerting effort to move muscles and joints against a variable amount of resistance. One of the key points in this is that normally this is done with a machine, some sort of a cable machine or a push-pull machine that you can see in the gym. So it's exerting a certain amount of resistance throughout your workout, throughout the entire repetition that you're doing, or throughout the entire movement. So those are the three types of exercise. As you can see, I kind of put pictures to remind you of what may encompass each type of physical activity. So aerobic exercise, I'm sure you guys have all heard of that. And a lot of people think, oh, aerobic exercise is running, and you would be right in thinking that. However, aerobic exercise is any exercise that requires a dramatic increased oxygen consumption over a long period of time. This is going to be important for your exam to know. So the two key characteristics in aerobic activity are increased oxygen consumption over a long period of time. So it has to be two. So running for a short period of time wouldn't necessarily be considered aerobic activity because it has to be over a long period of time. Are there any questions on that? Yes?
Is there like a certain time that would define that, or like past 10 minutes that would be considered aerobic, or?
That's a good point. But think about the increase in oxygen consumption. I feel like every single person may have a different capacity for that increased oxygen consumption, right? So each one of us is at a different physical fitness level, And so your oxygen consumption is going to be different, right? Based on your weight and physical fitness and stuff like that. But yeah. Now, you know, the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, they've put out these public health recommendations for physical activity. And they're based on a huge body of literature and research that basically says that exercise performed at a certain variable, like for a certain duration, for a certain amount of days per week, at a certain intensity, actually has different health benefits than activity that's not done at those times. So the physical activity recommendation suggests that healthy adults aged 18 to 65 need moderate intensity activity, aerobic activity, that's a key point as well, for a minimum of 30 minutes on 5 days a week, or vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity for a minimum of 20 minutes for 3 days each week. And you can probably guess that you can mix and match aerobic or moderate intensity physical activity with vigorous physical activity. It doesn't have to be exactly what the CDC says, but it should be comparable in the amount of time and the duration that you're working out. If physical activity is performed at certain durations, frequencies, and intensities, health benefits actually increase. So, physical activity performed possibly at lower or higher intensities for a longer or shorter amount of time, which is more or less frequent, doesn't necessarily have the same health benefits as the recommended public health dose. So the public health recommendation dose is basically based on all of this research that suggests that for different diseases, every single disease or condition listed on this list is basically affected by a dose-response relationship of how often you're working out, how intensely you're working out, and also how long each set of exercise is. So, for example, in obesity or metabolic syndrome, so obesity causes metabolic syndrome later on, there's a dose-response relationship in that. Basically, they suggest that people who are obese have to work out over 150 minutes per week in order to reduce their weight. Now that would be considered a dose-response relationship because you're not, an obese person or someone who's overweight isn't necessarily going to lose weight unless they're engaging at a certain amount, unless they're engaging in a certain amount of physical activity, a certain number of times each week for a certain amount of time. Obscured. So intensity refers to the rate at which activity is being performed or the magnitude of effort that is required to perform an exercise or physical activity. So this basically means it's how hard the person is working to when they do the activity. So each person is going to have a different physical activity or intensity of physical activity based on their own physical fitness and also their weight. So intensity of different forms of physical activity varies between people. It depends on the previous exercise experience, relative level of fitness, and also weight, because weight is taken into account through Newton's second law of motion. One way is called the Vo2 Max. So Vo2 Max is actually measuring how much oxygen you're putting out while you're doing the activity. As you guys can imagine, that probably takes a lot of different machines and a lot of money to basically hook someone up to these machines to measure their oxygen output. So that's one way to do it. However, we came up with metabolic equivalents, and we use those as an objective way to understand physical activity intensity, and we can basically figure out how intense someone is working in any physical activity that they're doing with a metabolic equivalent. Almost any activity you could possibly imagine is on this list. So if you, for your project, wanted to do physical activity, it may be really interesting for you to incorporate the intensity. So how intense are you working during each physical activity bout? And maybe something to take into consideration on top of how often you're working out and how long each session is. So it could be really cool to do that. And if you go to this website, every single physical activity is on there. So you can see how many metabolic equivalents each activity actually is. So that's a great resource. Okay. You guys think that it's important to be physically active?
It releases like healthy or peptides into like the brain.
Absolutely, absolutely. It can improve your mood. It increases healthy different hormones and molecules that make you feel really good. That's great. We're going to go over that. What else? Why is it important to be physically active? You see it all the time in the news. The CDC has all these recommendations, right? Why? For what? What's the point? To prevent obesity, right? So obesity, having a high body weight makes you vulnerable to a lot of different chronic diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So obesity can actually be a precursor to a lot of these chronic diseases that are preventable. Why else is it important to be physically active? Okay, so for your health, right? If you're sedentary or if you're not active, if you're not engaging in physical activity, you're at a higher risk for every single one of these diseases. So cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, colon and breast especially. There's been a lot of research done on colon and breast cancer that say that physical activity can actually be preventative. Obesity, which is what you mentioned. Hypertension, bone and joint diseases. So later on in life, it can actually prevent you from getting osteoporosis. And also depression. So let's talk about depression. Highly active people are less depressed than people who are not active. Now, this is a pervasive finding across all kinds of studies in psychology. We have found time and time again in healthy populations and clinically depressed populations in almost every population that this finding holds true. So I wanted to point out a really cool study by Dunn and colleagues. They divided people with major depression disorder, so it's a clinical diagnosis. They had people split into 5 different groups. And 4 of those groups engaged in some form of exercise, and the control group engaged in a form of stretching. So they just did some sort of stretching, but it wasn't necessarily any intense physical activity. Okay, they divided them into a low-dose physical activity group, 3 days a week, low-dose physical activity group, 5 days a week, the public health dose, 3 days a week, and then the public health physical activity dose, 5 days a week. And results found that aerobic exercise at a dose consistent with the public health dose was actually just as effective in treating mild to moderate major depressive disorder as medications and therapy. And guess what? It's much cheaper. So